Hello and welcome to the rocket tier list. This is going to be the first tier list with my new ranking system. So in case you guys didn't see the origin trait tier list, I basically went over in the first 6 minutes of that video some of the problems that you guys have brought up to me, as well as some of the issues that I have with my current tier list system. This tier list is going to be done with the new system in place. So instead of using scoring, it's going to use just literally rankings. So all the rockets are going to be ranked individually head to head. So every time a rocket is in a higher tier than another rocket, that means that I have personally vouched that one weapon is better than another holistically, on the whole. Okay. The old tier list, all the old tier lists, before rockets, linears, anything we're doing after this, they're going to be revisited before next season, and we're going to adjust all of them in the spreadsheet to my liking and to your guys' liking. And one of the major changes here, if you guys don't want to go back and watch the origin trait video, is that we're basically only considering the best case for a weapon, and we're splitting the perks into columns rather than categories. So with that being said, I'm going to go over some of the factors that I'm considering for rockets, and then going forward, all of the weapons that we're talking about in the future are basically going to consider the same things. So for rockets, we're considering the frame. So if you guys don't know, adaptives and aggressives do the highest DPS out of any rocket in the game. Adaptives doing, firing slightly less quickly, but having better stats overall, and aggressives firing slightly faster but having poor stats. And then high impacts do a base value, whereas adaptive and aggressives do 10% more, and then precisions do 10% less than high impacts. So obviously adaptives are going to be preferred, aggressives are going to be preferred, high impacts are going to be slightly less preferred, and precisions are the worst of the bunch when it comes to rockets. Okay. Obviously precisions also have like inbuilt tracking module, but that tends to not be a factor most of the time, even in activities like GMs. So, unless that was a standout perk on a weapon, like a best in slot perk on a weapon, I didn't choose to mention it. Okay, so that's pretty much it. We're gonna, talk about column perks, frame. We're gonna talk about whether a weapon is craftable. So sometimes certain perks being enhanced, like field prep, are worth enhancing, or enhanced bait and switch, stuff like that, or enhanced surrounded. That's gonna make the difference between one rocket and another, but usually not. And we're also going to talk about origin trait, because that's something that was a common critique earlier on in some of these tier lists, that I wasn't considering origin traits enough. So now that I know everything there is to know about origin traits, I feel a lot more comfortable considering them and factoring them in when it comes to ranking rockets. So with that out of the way, I think we've gone over everything I wanted to say about forming the tier list. So let's actually get to talking about the tier list itself. So I have all, 22 rockets here lined up in alphabetical order, and we're going to start with Apex Predator. So Apex Predator was reprised from Last Wish relatively recently. This rocket is craftable, and it has some absolutely insane perks. It's a solar adaptive rocket with 9 reserves. And in terms of what you're looking for on this rocket, you're going to be looking for Reconstruction and Demolitionist in the first column, probably Reconstruction, maybe Demo in like a GM or something like that. Grenade builds when it comes to damage are much less common these days, so Reconstruction is going to be what most people are using, but Reconstruction is so goddamn good on a rocket that, people tend to use it for pretty much like everything, whether it's GMs, whether it's doing damage. This rocket, Reconstruction allows it to do pretty much everything. And in the second column, you're going to be using bait and switch the vast majority of the time, but when you're not looking to use bait and switch and you're in like a GM, obviously in a GM bait and switch is a little less relevant. You're going to be looking at something like Bipod, and in some rare damage scenarios, you're going to be using something like Surrounded. Normally, Explosive Light would be a great perk on a rocket, but this rocket has so many good perks that are actually better that, in my opinion, you don't really ever have a reason to use Explosive Light on Apex Predator. So, this thing is, creme de la creme. But basically, it was the rank 1 rocket. So obviously, I mentioned here something that I didn't do before is I ranked all of the rockets from 1 to 22. And Apex was number 1, so this thing is going to go in the S tier. It's great for GMs, which are one of the places rockets are used in, and it's great for just doing damage to bosses as well. Rockets are absolutely nuts for both of those things, and Apex excels in both contexts. Okay, so that's Apex out of the way. Let's move to Ascendancy next. Oh, this is a bit of a fall from grace. S tier, top of the list, and we're falling to rank 20. This is number 20 out of 22. And this weapon is a fixed roll It's a solar precision, not craftable, no origin trait, and it has 9 in reserves. And if we're looking at this thing's perks, you can either use Impulse or Ambitious. Impulse would be more for like a damage, just straight firing the rocket over and over. Ambitious would be more like for GMs, because you're obviously going to get a kill if you use a rocket on ads. So it's basically like free clown cartridge, if you can think about it like that. And chain reaction kind of sucks on rockets, so explosive light is really what you'd be looking for here. This thing is pretty bad. I'm gonna go ahead and put it in the D tier, right? It's basically baby's first rocket, you know, has no really solid reload perks, and explosive light is good, but you know, it's kind of basically restricted to GMs, and you're losing 20% damage for free against adaptives and aggressives, so pretty mediocre. We're gonna leave it in D tier. Okay, let's go on to Bad Omens. Bad Omens, this is rank 11 in our total ranking. This is a Gambit rocket from ye old days, and it is an aggressive. It's an aggressive void rocket, and it has a very tight perk pool. The only things you're really going to be looking at here, there were auto and field prep and cluster bomb. A lot of the old rockets that you'll notice from year 3, year 2, etc., they're going to have auto, field prep, tracking, cluster. Those are going to be like the big 4 perks that you tend to see on these rockets, and Bad Omens is not really an exception. So most of the time, you know, if you're using this rocket, you're going to be on auto cluster or field cluster, both of which are decent. They're okay, right? So we're going to put this thing right in the middle of the pack in the B tier. It's usable for damage. It's usable for GMs if you really want to use it for that. Cluster bomb is essentially what I would equate to being like a 10% damage perk overall, with the likelihood of your clusters actually hitting the boss. You know, if all of your clusters hit the boss, it's something like a 22% damage perk, but that's never ever going to happen. So on average, I would say on most bosses, you're going to hit maybe 2 or 3 clusters, and that's going to add up to around maybe like 10% of an extra damage perk. So that's what I would consider. It's kind of like Vorpal, except for it's a little bit weirder, and wolf packs don't apply to clusters, so it's actually worse than Vorpal in a way. Okay, anyways, Bad Omens is gone. And let's talk about Blowout. Also, something I didn't mention is Apex Predator has Explosive Pack at its origin trait, but that's not an origin trait that affects it whatsoever. So, you know, it's probably why I didn't really mention it. But in case you were wondering, yeah, it does have Explosive Pack as its origin trait. Next up, we have Blowout. Blowout is actually rank 4 amongst all of the rockets. And Blowout's an adaptive arc rocket, right? And if we look at its massive perk pool, this is a Crucible playlist weapon. So it has a massive... what is this, like 11 by 11, 12 by 12? Yeah, 12 by 12. So out of this entire mess of perks, what are you really going to use? Well, you're basically going to use either field prep or demo, and you're going to use pretty much just explosive light. I'm going to explicitly avoid lasting impression on rockets most of the time, because frenzy is just better than lasting impression, because with wolf packs included, since wolf packs don't affect lasting, frenzy is practically the same amount of damage with no delayed detonation. I'm also going to pick explosive light over both of these perks because it just does more damage overall. So, you know, if you have a rocket with explosive light, there's not really any reason to use frenzy or lasting. So you're basically going to be doing field or demo and explosive light on this rocket. Really no reason to use anything else. Maybe golden tricorn in some very rare instances, but I'm going to leave that out. I don't really think that's worth using on this rocket in particular. That being said, this goes solidly in the A tier as our rank 4 rocket out of 22. As for origin traits, this thing doesn't really have anything of note either. The best thing you could use is probably One Quiet Moment, but that's a pretty bad origin trait, to be honest with you. Okay, let's keep going. Next up, we have Braytech Osprey, a relatively new addition to the field of rockets that are currently available in the game. This thing, I ranked it at rank 8 out of 22. It's a high impact void. It's a nightfall pool rocket, so you can kind of focus farm for it. It's a pretty small perk pool, which is kind of nice. And it has some rare combos that we haven't really seen on rockets before. I mean, it has 2 damage perks, right? You can run 2 at once. It has Cluster Frenzy, it has Cluster Lasting, Cluster Bipod. There's a couple options that you got with it. Unfortunately, one of the 2 damage perks that it got is Cluster. And if you're going to run 2 damage perks, you're missing out on Envious, you're missing out on Field, you're missing out on Auto. So not great. If you're going to run perks on this thing, you're either going to run probably Cluster, Envious, Field in the first column, and in the second column, you're probably going to either run Bipod or Frenzy, maybe Tricorn, like maybe Tricorn, but usually not. So With that being said, yeah, I think those are pretty much the perks you're going to run on this thing. This thing is basically just for like void GMs, like void surge GMs. It's pretty much it. So I'm just going to put this thing solidly in the B tier in front of Bad Omens, because it's rank 8. Bad Omens is rank 11. And as for this thing's origin traits, neither of them is that good. Vanguard's Vindication is really small amount of health restoration, and Stunning Recovery is, you know, you're probably not stunning a champ with your rocket, so that's probably not going to happen. Yeah, that's pretty much it for Braytech Osprey. Let's move on to Bump in the Night. Okay, so Bump in the Night is from Season of the Haunted. It's a craftable stasis aggressive rocket. I think it was the second stasis rocket to come out. Pretty small perk pool, and of course it's craftable. So let's take a look at this thing. What does it have? If you're going to use this thing, you're probably using it for chill clip, right? But it does have demo, auto, field prep, and it also has chill clip and frenzy. Those are all valid perks to run on this thing in endgame content. Now, the only reason I bring up chill clip, because you guys know that I've famously talked about how chill clip reduces the amount of damage you do as a team to a boss. You're not going to be using this thing for boss damage. In general, you're probably not going to be using this thing for boss damage, you know, just period. But that being said, chill clip does stun overloads, so it can be kind of a multi-purpose rocket in GMs. And, you know, having a damage perk on your rocket in GMs is important, but, you know, having chill clip isn't the worst compromise in the world. And overall, this thing does have auto frenzy, you know, demo frenzy, field frenzy. You know, it's not horrible. You'd probably be using this thing as a utility rocket, like as a GM rocket, more so than a damage rocket, I should say. And it has extrovert. Extrovert is pretty decent, right? Definitely better than all the origin traits we've been looking at so far on all of these rockets. So yeah, I went ahead and I ranked Bump in the Night as 5th. It doesn't have explosive light, which is a big no-no, but besides that, it has a lot of good perks in the first column, and it has frenzy and chill clip, which are decent in the second column. So pretty good. Quintessential stasis GM rocket for like stasis surge GMs. Okay, let's move on and let's talk about Code Duello. This is an old fan favorite. Back when, you know, people were quick swapping with rockets, and back before the frame changes that made precisions and high impacts worse than adaptives and aggressives. This thing was a hot commodity back when lasting impression was like the best perk you could get on a rocket. Yeah, this thing was the shit. These days, not looking too hot. Code Duello is ranked 13th, so right in the middle of the pack of all of the rockets. And yeah, it's a solar high impact. The perks you're going to be looking for on this thing are going to be field and auto and frenzy. Remember what I said, frenzy is a better damage perk than lasting and cluster, so there's no real reason to be using those. So you're basically using field, auto, and frenzy. This thing, you know, it feels really good to use, but besides that, you know, there's not much going for it. So I'm going to go ahead and put it solidly in the B tier behind Bad Omens, and we're going to call it at that and move on. Okay, next up we have Cold Comfort. Okay, Cold Comfort, this is a pretty notorious rocket from Ghost of the Deep. It is an aggressive stasis rocket. It's not craftable, but it does have the unique Restoration Ritual origin trait, which means that you can shoot 4 extremely high-powered rockets in a row to do among the highest burst damage, you know, DPS options in the game for a short period. So this thing is easily the strongest DPS rocket in the game in certain situations where you can get that envious proc off and shoot 4 rockets in a row. That being said, you know, it's surprising that, you know, this rocket actually isn't used in that many damage strategies just because of how much you have to do to set it up, along with the fact that most bosses where you're really trying to optimize damage, you know, 4 rockets isn't enough to kill them. And if you have dumped 4 rockets and you're kind of just sitting there, you know, you can't auto reload this thing anymore, right? You don't have reconstruction or anything like that. So this thing is less of a rotation beast and more of a straight dumping type of beast. So, you know, with that being said, it is still pretty good. It's still very, very good for damage, very much a damage specialist rocket. But it's not really suitable for stuff like GMs, really. I mean, if you look at its perks, the only 2 really kind of notable perks here are Envious and Bait and Switch. You're not really going to be using tracking. You're not really going to be using Explosive Light when you have Bait and Switch. And if you wanted to use a rocket for GMs, you'd be better suited with Bump in the Night. So really the only 2 perks that are really relevant on this rocket are Envious and Bait and Switch, and I'm going to leave it at that. we're going to put this thing in the A tier. I'm going to put it, it's ranked second amongst all the rockets. Now you might be wondering, you know, why isn't Cold Comfort in S tier with Apex Predator? Well, for those of you that have been paying attention, I think it's fairly obvious. Apex Predator does everything, right? It's the best solar GM rocket. It's a great GM rocket even when it's not a solar burn GM. It's, you know, just generally extremely versatile for damage, used over Cold Comfort in most scenarios. And Cold Comfort is really just a damage specialist, and that's why the S tier is named universally good, while the A tier is named individually strong. These rockets are all plenty individually strong for either GMs or damage, whereas Apex Predator does literally everything. Apex Predator has power crept pretty much every rocket in the game. Okay, let's move to Crowning Duologue next. Now, Crowning Duologue is a Solstice rocket. It's a strand precision rocket with a kind of a tight perk pool as well. If you're going to use this thing, in my opinion, what you should be using is Demo, right? Demo and Ad Junkie. And this thing is basically going to be like a GM rocket where you're, you know, relying on a grenade build and, you know, getting Ad Junkie stacks either by grenade kills or by, you know, killing a bunch of ads with Wolfpack rounds. Now, you know, this thing is pretty decent in that regard. There are other precision frames that are worse for GMs. So, you know, I didn't rank this thing all the way at the bottom, but it is ranked 18th out of 22. And, you know, being a precision frame, it has, you know, no real damage perk in the second column for bosses. Envious Assassin in the fourth column is just really weird. The only thing that really redeems this rocket, for like, you know, GMs and stuff like that is Dreamwork. Dreamwork basically kind of acts like Clown Cartridge or like Ambitious Assassin, as long as you get some assist kills in the activity that you're doing, which if you're doing a GM and you're using Wolfpack rounds, you're almost always going to be doing that and meeting this condition. So it's kind of nice for that. You know, it means you kind of have a free perk from Dreamwork, and the other perks you can kind of just choose whatever to meet your build. So with that being said, I'm going to put this thing in the C tier. Again, it's like mostly usable, but because it's a precision frame and because it lacks, you know, a really solid damage perk in the second column, it loses out to a lot of the stuff in B and A tier. Okay, so that's Crowning Duologue. Dreamwork is pretty unique, but that's pretty much all I have to say about that. Let's move on to Heretic. Heretic is an altars rocket. It is, I believe, an adaptive... Oh no, it's an aggressive arc rocket. And if we look at this thing's perk pool, it's pretty disappointing. It has pretty much just field prep and lasting and cluster. That's really what you're going to be looking at here. Lasting or cluster, it can go kind of either way depending on what you want to use it for. Cluster more for GMs, lasting more for like boss damage if you want to use this thing for boss damage. Yeah, this thing is ranked 12th out of all of the rockets, and I don't really think there's much to say about this thing. I'm just going to put it solidly above Code Duello, right above Code Duello. It has a better frame than Code Duello, but it lacks autoloading. And I think at the end of the day, you know, it having the better frame makes it a little bit better for GMs. And, you know, yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say about that. It is an aggressive and Code Duello is a high impact. And that's what edges it over. Okay, let's move on to Hezen Vengeance. Hezen Vengeance from the Vault of Glass. So this thing used to be pretty awesome for damage. You know, a lot of people used to use an auto-lasting Hezen for DPS with an overflow swap with a time-lost version. It's fallen off quite a bit since then. It is still pretty decent, right? It's an aggressive frame, so it's one of the highest damage archetypes in the game. It's not craftable, but it does have some decent perks, right? It has all the pre-explosive light perks, basically. It has auto, it has lasting, it has overflow swap for time lost version, it has demo. So really what you're going to be looking for on this weapon is really, like I said, auto, overflow, and lasting demo. That's really what you're going to be looking for on this weapon. And I rank this thing 6th, actually. I rank this thing 6th. It's, you know, decent for damage. It's obviously worse than Apex, and it's also usable. I'm not going to say it's good. It's usable for GMs as well. If it had a worse frames, it would be abysmal, but it does have the, you know, one of the best frames, which means, you know, what it lacks in a solid damage perk for GMs, it does make up for in its, you know, utility perks as well as its frame. So yeah, that's Hezen Vengeance for you. Let's move on to the next rocket. We have Hoosegow next. So Hoosegow, like I mentioned, remember how I said that Bad Omens is one of those, you know, older rockets that kind of has the same perks as every rocket from that era. This is another one. We're looking field prep, cluster, auto, tracking. You're going to see those 4 perks on a lot of rockets. They're all going to be placed in a similar location. Hoosegow, I've ranked it 10th, whereas I believe Bad Omens is 11th. So Hoosegow is going to go right in front of Bad Omens. And yeah, I mean, that's pretty much it. The only reason why I think I put it over Bad Omens is because it has Demolitionist, which I believe Bad Omens does not have Demolitionist. Yeah, Bad Omens doesn't have Demolitionist. So I put Hoosegow a little bit ahead because if you're using like a grenade build, you know, you can get your grenade back faster. That being said, you know, I really hope you're not using a Hoosegow in a GM. I mean, you can, right? It's in the better half of the rockets, but still, you know, Hoosegow is Hoosegow. I don't know. People used to use this thing for like Riven DPS and low mans because field prep cluster. But besides that, that's pretty much all it's good for. We're going to leave it in the B tier and move on to Palmyra-B. So Palmyra-B, this guy's definitely got a legendary status from back when precision frames weren't bad. It was like the first rocket with like auto explosive, I think, back in the day. And you know, it has enhanced auto, enhanced explosive because it's craftable. Unfortunately, it is a precision frame, so you know that does make it basically a free minus 20% against the best archetypes in the game, despite having auto explosive, which is a decent roll. Its origin trade doesn't do much for it. Hockey breach armaments is practically useless for a rocket to have. I mean, if you're ever doing, I guess, I don't know, GM proving grounds and you need to shoot a tank with a rocket, I guess this does 15% more. Despite losing 20% against adaptive. So I don't know. If they ever come up with an adaptive with Hawkeye, it might be extremely niche and useful. But besides that, this rocket, it had its time in the sun. It's pretty much washed up at this point. Auto explosive. I've ranked this thing as 17th out of 22, and that's going to put it in the C tier. I believe it goes right above Crowning Duologue. Yeah, it's I think it's the best precision if I'm not mistaken, but I could be wrong. So let's keep going through the list here. We might find a better one, but I think that's likely the highest precision frame in the entire list. Yeah, let's move on to Red Herring. So Red Herring is a craftable void adaptive from the Witch Queen, I believe it's from the Throne World. Yeah, it's from the Throne World. And this thing, unfortunately, it doesn't have any good reload perks for damage. So you're basically just going to be using this thing for GMs. You're going to be stuck using it for GMs. And it does have an enhanced field prep. You know, it does have Frenzy, which is nice. It also has, you know, Golden Tricorn, which I think is like a Frenzy equivalent. In my opinion, you know, Golden Tricorn is... The only reason I mention it on this rocket and not other rockets like Braytech Osprey is because this thing really only has Frenzy as like a really solid damage perk. I mean, I guess Adjunky is decent too for GMs. And Golden Tricorn, even without getting any ability kills, starts at 15%. So that's why I kind of mention it as an alternative to Frenzy here. That being said, yeah, this thing is basically just restricted to Void Surge GMs, but it is an adaptive and it is craftable. And it has Psycho Hack, which is like, okay, you know, it's not bad. I mean, most of the time when you're shooting something with a rocket in a GM, it's dead, so it's not doing damage to you. And Psycho Hack's only 10%, so it's not much. But that being said, you know, it's pretty decent. It's would I take this or Braytech? Probably be a toss-up. Depends. You know, depends if I had a good Braytech roll. But yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and toss this thing in the B tier. I believe it's ranked 7th. Yeah, it's ranked 7th, and Braytech is ranked 8th. So they're right neck and neck. You could probably trade these kind of preferential. You know, what you take between the two for a Void GM. They're pretty similar. And yeah, we're gonna move on. What do we have next? We have Roar of the Bear. Roar of the Bear. So this is an Iron Banner rocket. This one got a refresh kind of recently. And what does this thing have in store for us? So it's a solar high impact. It's got a pretty tight perk pool. It's got Skulking Wolf, which is useless in PvE. So let's just focus on the perks themselves. So if you're going to use this thing, a lot of people like the demo lasting roll back in the Starfire days. This was like the best solar rocket for damage back then. These days, though, you're not really looking at those perks, or lasting at least. You're going to be looking really at field prep demo and maybe lasting, and cluster. I mean, it's basically these 4 perks here. You're not going to sacrifice a damage perk for auto. Incandescent, you know, not really relevant because most of the time in GMs, because this is a GM rocket, don't get me wrong. Most of the time in GMs, if you're shooting ads with a rocket, they're just going to, you know, they're just going to die. So there's nothing left to scorch or ignite. so it's kind of whatever. Yeah, I mean, you're probably best off using this thing with like demo cluster or field cluster in like GMs or something. I don't know. This thing is pretty... Yeah, it doesn't have much use these days. Even in solo damage phases, Apex is just so dominant. So yeah, I've ranked this thing 15th out of 22. And so we're going to place it in the C tier above Palmyra and its company. So yep, that's pretty much it for Roar the Bear. Let's move on to our next rocket, which is Royal Entry. So Royal Entry, back before Precision Frames got nerfed, this guy was king of the hill. This thing had auto lasting back when lasting was considered good. It had field prep clown cartridge before Hothead was cool. This thing is like the OG. Unfortunately, Bungie did this thing dirty. They did give it, you know, Vanguard Vindication, which is like, you know, it's fine, I guess, for a pretty small amount of health return. But yeah, they did this thing dirty. Its perks are no longer like super relevant. It's a precision frame now, which means it's like minus 20% against the best, which means unfortunately it's knocked down all the way to the bottom of this list. I mean, like I mentioned, it has field prep clown, it has auto lasting, but yeah, I mean, that's pretty much all that's going for it. You know, it's like a Royal Entry is the definition of an artifact of the past. You know, it is very, very much so an artifact of the past. We're gonna put it in the D tier. It's ranked 19th out of 22. I believe it is still above Ascendancy. Yeah, it's one position above Ascendancy. And yeah, let's move on. That's pretty much it for Royal Entry. We have Semiotician next. Now, Semiotician is a new rocket from Season of the Witch this season. It is craftable, and it's a strand high impact. So, you know, off to an okay start. But now let's take a look at the perks. If we look at the first column, there's pretty much nothing relevant here except field prep. And if we look at the second column, I mean, what do we have? We have like explosive light, right? We have bipod. The rest of the perks not really relevant in the face of, you know, these perks over here. So, I mean, field prep bipod in a strand surge GM. If this thing was an adaptive, it would be pretty good for GM clear. Besides that, I mean, it's, you know, it's a high impact, so it does okay damage. Field bipod is nice. Field explosive is decent. You know, I'm gonna go ahead and put this thing in the B tier. I think it ranked 9th overall, which means we place it right underneath Braytech Osprey, which makes sense. Braytech Osprey has a better perk diversity, has that double damage perk thing going on. This thing is crafted, so craftable field prep is kind of nice. Enhanced field prep is kind of nice. So these things are pretty close as well. All right, let's keep going. We have 5 rockets left. Let's talk about Shining Sphere. So Shining Sphere is, again, like I mentioned to you guys earlier, one of the OG adaptive frame rockets. And of course, these perks are going to be very, very recognizable to anybody who knows old rockets. Field prep, auto, tracking, demo. No cluster though. But yeah, no cluster means, unfortunately, you know, no damage perk at all, which is a big minus. However, it is still an adaptive. But we are going to put this thing in the C tier. It's ranked 16th out of 22, which means it goes right behind Roar the Bear. If we want to think about this mathematically, this is basically the same thing as a Palmyra, because a Palmyra is a explosive light is a 25% damage perk, but since explosive light doesn't interact with Wolfpack rounds, it ends up evening out to about the same as the plus 20% that you get from Shining Sphere. And Shining Sphere is basically Palmyra, except for it has, you know, explosive light like built in because of the archetype, and then you have like auto and tracking. So it's literally like the same thing as Palmyra. It's just higher like base damage, I suppose. So that's pretty much it for Shining Sphere. Let's move on. Okay, 4 rockets left. Let's talk about Sleepless. Sleepless is from the Dreaming City. It's an arc high impact, and unfortunately, this thing pretty much has like no like relevant damage perk. I mean, I'm not even going to include Vorpal as something you might use on this thing. Let's just call it, let's say this is like a GM rocket, and you have auto demo, you have like field demo. Yeah, not great. I ranked this thing 21st out of 22, which means it's going to go to the bottom of the D tier. And yeah, let's keep going. Let's go to our next rocket, Subzero Salvo. Speaking of the bottom of the list, Subzero Salvo, dude, the Europa weapons, I mean, pretty commonly known that a lot of them were misses. Subzero Salvo is no exception to that list. I mean, this thing has, I mean, look at this thing's first, oh my god, look at this thing's first column, dude. Like, oh, that is a national tragedy. I mean, like, underdog, surplus, quick draw, killing wind, moving, why did they put moving target on? Okay. This is hurting me internally. I mean, it has the worst first column I think I've ever seen on a rocket, possibly. And then on the second column, you have like cluster and demo. or something. I don't know. This thing is awful. And it's a precision frame too, so it's the worst archetype. Easily worst rocket in the game. We're going to put this thing in the D tier. I don't think anyone's going to have any reservations about that. And finally, let's end off on, you know, a high-ish note. We have the Hothead up next. The Hothead, legendary rocket. Before Apex came out, this thing was king. Everyone loved this thing. Unfortunately, Explosive Light has been vastly surpassed by Surrounded and Bait and Switch as damage perks on bosses. However, this thing is still an excellent arc GM rocket. Easily the best Arc Surge GM rocket. It has plenty of great GM perks, like Field Prep, like Clown Cartridge, like Demo, like Auto, like Explosive Light. Even Ad Junkie, right? Has a lot of solid GM perks. I have ranked this rocket as 3rd behind Cold Comfort in terms of endgame usability, and I don't think anyone's going to have any problems with that. Origin trait-wise, it's got the same thing as all the Nightfall weapons do, so you're probably going to be using Vanguard Vindication unless you can somehow get a stun onto your rocket using, you know, some sort of like Radiant or something like that, or like Volatile. Yeah, you're going to be using Vanguard's Vindication, which is just, you know, it's all right. It's fine. And finally, we have Tomorrow's Answer. Tomorrow's Answer. Okay, so Tomorrow's Answer is an old Trials rocket. I don't think you can get this thing right now. They might reprise it. They will probably reprise it, to be honest. It's a void high impact, very tight perk pool. Unfortunately though, you're only going to be looking at auto lasting or auto cluster, which again, very old style perk pool, you know, nothing crazy like this. Very much a year 2, year 3 type of rocket. You know, not bad, just middle of the pack. I ranked it 14th out of 22, and that's going to land it a solid spot in the C tier. Right above Roar of the Bear, I believe. Yeah, because Roar of the Bear doesn't have auto. Okay, yeah, that's pretty much it for this tier list. You know, Apex Predator is alone in the S tier. I don't think there's anything here that should be particularly surprising to anyone. Yes, all of the rockets are ordered within tiers, and I've separated the rockets. I think you can see kind of clearly. S tier is Jack of all trades. A tier is really good at damage or really good at GM stuff. And then B tier is pretty good at GMs or pretty good at damage, but suboptimal archetype or something like that. Suboptimal damage perk, like in the case of like Bad Omens. Mostly usable tier is, you know, mostly high impacts or good precisions. And then D tier is precisions that are not good, or Sleepless, which is a high impact that is very not good. So I think that's pretty much it. I think that's all I have to say about rockets. I will say that reserves didn't really play much of a role in considerations here, and neither did origin traits, because most of the origin traits and reserve counts on rockets are not really significant. So yeah, if you guys have any questions about this tier list, let me know. If you have any critiques, I've really spent a lot of time refining the tier list process, getting rid of scoring, getting rid of arbitrary elements, getting rid of diversity weighting. I've really tried my best to orient the order of the tier list and the rankings that I've done for the rockets strictly based on how the rockets are used in endgame content, how viable these weapons are in order. So with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and show you guys my ranking sheet here. If we go ahead and rank from A to Z, you can see every single rocket here with all of the factors that I use to consider for ranking. And I hope that clears these things up. In the next month or so, you're going to see me go back through every single tab here and redo every single tier list using this format. And I think that will end up with results that a lot of you will be a lot happier with when it comes to being more accurate in the nitty gritty. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Next up after rockets, we're going to be doing linear fusions. And then we're going to move on to stuff like exotics, and we're going to have a lot of fun with that. So I'll see you guys around, and yeah, hope you enjoyed.